So, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about weight shifting and weight loading. You see, there's kind of two types of action. Let's put this in Dungeons and Dragons terms. There's kind of your standard actions, and most of the time a standard action is going to be anything from a mundane task like picking up a pencil to a complex task like, performing a one-armed handstand or something. These are standard actions. They are in the environment and sometimes against the environment, but it's just you doing the action. But there's another kind of action. It's called contested action. And contested action is when something, even the environment, is actively working against you. And you might think, well, isn't lifting weights contested? No, because you're simply overcoming something that is in the environment. It's not actively fighting against you any more than, standing up is gravity fighting against you, which it is, but it's not considered actively contesting you. When I say contested action, I mean more somebody is trying to stop you or intercept you or something along that lines. You're not just trying to overcome inertia. You are literally trying to overcome opposition. And in those two circumstances, in standard actions versus contested actions, you have to take into account that your weight shifting will vary. A good example, in Wing Chun, we tend to keep our weight back a bit. So if I'm in a square stance, I'm fairly even. But if I'm in any kind of a split stance or a shifted stance, I tend to have my weight back a little bit to keep my structure and spinal alignment strong and rooted and grounded. And that way my weapons forward are light and free to move. But it's not always the case. You see in some arts they have push kicks, and the Muay Thai roundhouse kick is a total commitment kick. It's not something that you snap back, though you can against a target, but if the target is weak or if you miss, you're fully committed to it, and generally speaking, you have to spin out or land and recover, which is not generally advisable. So there's that, but there's another side to it, and that's that as I shift my weight, and we're talking simple forward and backward and lateral movement, we're not talking really complex weight shifts with multiple balance points and stuff. But if I'm moving forward in contested action against somebody, and I put all of my weight forward so that my weight is no longer on the leg that is grounding me, then if they do something to off-balance me or something in the environment that I'm contesting in off-balances me, I have a much higher risk of falling and putting myself in a much worse position. Wing Chun, we have a move called Lop Sao, it means pulling hand. If somebody catches me like that, say I'm throwing one of these big ass haymakers and all my weight's coming forward and somebody, deflects it and grabs and pulls, guess where I'm going? Going forward, because all of my weight was shifted poorly. But if I throw a rounder punch with my weight either even or back a bit and somebody catches me, I've got an anchor. Now, we'll call them escape maneuvers. For your classic, basic survival style parkour, there's a lot of forward shifting, because in parkour you're not contesting against somebody else except perhaps somebody chasing you, in which case going forward is particularly valuable. But shifting forward allows you to dive and reach out for vaulting and whatnot, and to extend and elongate your aerial time, your climb, your jump, your crawl, whatever it is. So in that case, the forward weight is more important than the back weight. Generally speaking, when we're standing, we're looking for a relatively even weight. You don't want to be seated back on your heels, and you don't want to be seated all forward on your toes. You want your feet to feel relatively weightless underneath you. And going from there, depending on the type of action you're going for, you may need to shift your weight forward or backwards. If you're doing knife work, guess what? You tend to be leaning and reaching a bit more because you're using a blade and, you know, keeping the bulk of your vitals out of the reach of, you know, your opponent, especially if it's a dueling blade type situation, or if you are contesting against a blade empty-handed. You generally want to keep your vitals away from the blade. So there's a lot more forward shifting in that kind of motion because you're not as worried about the person grabbing you and pulling you and tripping you and trying to tie you up for grappling. It can happen, it does happen. Grappling with knives does happen. It's not always recommended, but it does happen, and it can be a valuable skill to learn and at least understand. But for the most part, when somebody's attacking with a knife, the last thing they're thinking of is, how am I going to put this guy in a triangle choke? How am I going to, you know, flip this guy on his head and put him in a wrist lock? Not generally what's going through somebody's mind when they're trying to kill you with a knife. However, one of the things that is going through their mind is slash this motherfucker and make him stop doing whatever he was doing to make me upset. In which case, you generally want to keep those vitals away, which means forward shifting. So, in retrospect, something I hadn't thought about before, but it's an interesting point, is it seems, at least in the examples I've given, and maybe some feedback would be nice on this, but in the examples I've given, when you are trying to stay away from danger, when you're trying to actively get away from danger, you tend to kind of want your weight shifted a bit forward for reaching purposes, for extending, for grabbing, groping, for trying to accelerate your movement through a bad situation. However, in situations where you want to control and contain and dominate, you want your weight either neutral or back. I'm sure I could, you know, give me a little bit of time, I'm sure I could think of a few more. My wife looks angry. Anyway, I could probably think of a few more examples, you know, in differing circumstances. But understand that it does matter on the circumstance, and always, no matter what, whether you're flying through the air or throwing a punch or a kick, be in control of not only the movement that you are doing, but in how your weight is loaded and how you are shifting your weight during that movement, because that ideally, ultimately, is where the power is being generated and where the key of the movement is. That's all I got for you. I'll talk to you next time. Good journey.